Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Sweep Union, and in this one we have several developments across the front line, mainly surrounding the Donetsk region, where the Russians have sped up and doubled down on their offensive operations in the Pokrovsk and Kharkov directions, following a large-scale rotation which ended yesterday. Taking a closer look at the front line, we see first off in the direction of the northwest of Vuhledar that the Russians have managed to advance here in a direction of the fortified positions of the Ukrainians located in the western direction, and capturing a bit more of the area south of this river line. So we see that there are some positional fighting taking place in the area between Novoukrainka here to the west and Vuhledar here to the east. Further north here in the direction of Katerinivka, the Russians have advanced slightly within the eastern parts of the settlement, aligning the front line with their foothold in the south. This has allowed the Russians to strengthen their positions here in the Katerinivka direction, and they continue their pressure to take control over the settlement from the Ukrainians. Further north, there is the advances by the Russians west and southwest of Maximilianivka, where the Russians have advanced along the highway between Marinka and Kharkov, where they've managed to capture the fortified positions of the Ukrainians southwest of Maximilianivka along the high ground, and they've also advanced west of Maximilianivka towards the positions of the Ukrainians in the eastern outskirts of the dacha areas of Kharkov, marking the start of the Battle of Kharkov. This also further confirms the Russian capture of Maximilianivka and complete control of the settlement. So we see heavy fighting taking place in the east of Kharkov as the Russians have finished their rotation. In the northern direction, there's several developments here as well. Fighting continues in the direction of Soriane, where the Russians are looking to gain full control over the settlement. There's no clear information on how much they've captured so far, some leaving the entire settlement in the gray zone. The Russians have also managed to capture the fortified positions of the Ukrainians northeast of Hirnik. The Russians have also stormed Hirnik directly from the northern direction, gaining control over parts of the dash area in the western parts of the settlement and in the central parts of the settlement along the high-rise apartment complex areas. We see heavy fighting as the Russians storm Hirnik directly head-on, following a large bombing campaign that has continued over the past month. In the direction of Selydove, the Russians have broken through the railways all the way towards the settlement of Vishneve, cutting off the western road in and out of Selydove, leaving only this singular road remaining under Ukrainian control, which is only within less than 2 kilometers from the front line. This means that Russian firing positions along the northern parts of Selydove is close enough to have direct fire control with tanks, ATGMs, and these mid-range equipment. Even FPV operators are all within close enough proximity to constantly survey and attack this road. This means that Selydove is now completely operationally encircled, and there's hardly any possibility of the Ukrainians resupplying the settlement. According to the latest reports, the Ukrainians are attempting to resupply forces within the settlements using drones to drop a few calibers. There's about 50 kilograms they can hold, so there's not a lot of stuff that can go with these drones. But with constant runs, they can resupply somewhat their forces within Selydove on a day-to-day basis. In the eastern parts of Selydove, the Russian forces started storming settlements yet again, recapturing the industrial zone here along the quarry plant here in the northern parts. And with this, heavy fighting takes place in the eastern parts, southwestern parts, and northern parts of Selydove as the Russians look to completely encircle Selydove and the Ukrainian forces within it. Moving up further north, you see here in the direction of Kreminna, the Russians have started storming Tursk over the past few days, where it has seen very limited success. Now the Russians have managed to capture one of the fortified positions and gained a foothold in the farm area just outside of Tursk, but there's no significant advances by the Russians towards the settlement, allowing them to gain a foothold within the settlement itself. We do see heavy fighting in the fortified positions to the north as well, but no foothold within the settlement itself so far. Further north here in the direction of Vuhledar, the Russians have managed to capture more positions of the Ukrainians within the settlement itself, aligning the front line with the road between Sinkova and Krohlyakivka. The Russian offensive operations in this section of the front line continues to advance bit by bit within the settlement. In the Kursk region, there's been one confirmed advance by the Ukrainians, capturing portions here to the northwest of Marshanovka, where we see that the Ukrainians have managed to capture the forest lines here to the north, the farming area here to the west, and this has secured a wider area along the northern parts of Sucha. With this, we've covered all the territorial changes, and as you can see, I'm testing out a new map. Let me know what you think of this map compared to other maps. Now, moving on to the analysis, we see that the Russians here to the northwest of Vuhledar, their attempts to advance and spread out the front line a bit more allows them to capture some fortified positions, and the objective here is to widen the area in which they have a foothold across the river line and to allow for multiple possibilities where they are looking to find gaps in Ukrainian defenses. See, there's no defensive positions here in the central parts, but there is several in the direction of Vuhledar to the south and to the east of the settlement. The Russians will look to expand to attack from the southwestern direction, the eastern direction of Novokrainka, increasing the possibilities that they have available. This will prevent the Ukrainians from concentrating their forces in the defensive positions in one direction, but having to spread it out as well, to allow the Russians to attack these positions from multiple directions at the same time, to find more gaps in their defenses or weaknesses that they could show. In Katerinivka, there's no significant tactical or strategic developments. It is just a simple advance through the fortified positions of the Ukrainians within the settlement. In the direction of Maximilianivka, with the capture of the fortified positions southwest of Maximilianivka, as well as the high ground next to it, the Russians now have secure control over the settlement and will allow the Russians to start offensive operations directly towards Kurakhove, either through the fortified positions in a larger assault, which would be very risky, or to advance along the Dacha area east of Kurakhove, and then advance along the side of the fortified positions of the Ukrainians, similar to what they did in the south of Novohrodivka, where they managed to capture the fortified positions of the Ukrainians by advancing along the side of it, avoiding direct confrontation with it. So the Russians would likely look to advance through the Dacha area to the fortified positions of the Ukrainians and attacking it from the side rather than a head-on attack. Instead, what they've done is secure the high ground highway between Marinka and Kurakhove, and then it will allow it to advance towards the fortified positions of the Ukrainians from this side yet again. In the direction of Hirnik, we see several developments. The Russians have captured the fortified positions to secure Selane Persia and Selane Druhe for further offensive operations towards Suryane and crossings here between Selane Druhe and Hirnik to attack the rear of Hirnik. At the same time, it will also allow the Russians to storm the settlement from the east, again spreading the front line further, allowing for multiple possibilities of offensive operations. The Russians can now attack Hirnik from every single direction from the north, east, and southeast, but the western and southwestern parts remain completely secure, with the settlement of Ismailivka here to the northwest and Krohivka to the southeast, securing the flanks of Hirnik. So there's still a resupply option for the Ukrainians and withdrawal through the northern parts of Kurakhove. But this is also why we see Russian offensive operations being developed in the direction of Ismailivka and Selydove to exactly gain control of this fortified position, cutting off the supply and withdrawal options of the Ukrainians. Based on the advances made by the Russians, the heavy bombardment of the Russians have either caused a lot of casualties among the Ukrainians or forced them to withdraw further back, either completely out of this section of the front line or towards Kurakhivka or other rearguard positions, weakening the Ukrainian defensive positions within the settlement and allowing the Russians to have a strong initial push. If they can keep up the momentum, they would be able to capture Hirnik fairly quickly, and that will allow them to move on to the industrial areas and then move through these areas towards the northern flank of Kurakhove, getting within close enough vicinity to heavily bombard Kurakhove and use FPV drones on their positions. If Russians capture the northern flank of Kurakhove, the Ukrainians would have very few positions where they can operate FPV drones from. Take a look at the settlements here to the south. They are about 10 kilometers, 9 kilometers from Kurakhove, which means that the range is too far for FPV drones to be operated. from these settlements. This means that the Russians would have to completely demolish Kurhove, and they would not really fear that much FPV operators or similar, as they would be too far away to operate in that direction, but the Russians would be close enough on the northern bank of the river to operate. Most FPV drones operators would be within Kurhove, and heavily bombarding it would disable their ability to be used. In the direction of Selydove, we see that the Russians continue offensive operations in the eastern, northern, and southern parts of Selydove, continuing the operations to flank the settlement and cutting off its supplies with a breakthrough towards Vishneve. Fighting over the settlement has begun. Gaining full control of that would completely cut off the supply road and allow for direct fire positions between the Russian positions and the final positions along the final supply route in and out of Selydove would be within fire control of both sides, and the Ukrainians are simply too vulnerable to be using this road. It would be the second highway of death, similar to that of the Bakhmut highway here to the west of the settlement when the Russians were heavily bombarding it, the one here going through Khomova towards the Chasiv microdistrict. So we see that a similar situation has unfolded here in the Selydove direction, where the Russians have managed to encircle the Ukrainian forces, and the Ukrainian forces here in the area, they have at least 2 brigades within the settlement. That's up to 4,000 soldiers. This is double that of Vuhledar, and we saw what happened in Vuhledar. The 72nd Mechanized Brigade was routed, and it basically is non-existent. They have their FPV drones operators remaining, and that's about it for the 72nd Mechanized Brigade. You'll unlikely see more combat in the rest of the war. Moving further north, we see here in the direction of Kreminna, the fighting reaching Torske and the outskirts of it. Yet again, my assessment is that this is a very risky and very difficult mission to succeed with. I see the point of the Russians wanting to gain control of the eastern bank of the river, and moving towards Turkey through the central parts is the best opportunity they have to do so. That is, if they don't want to capture the villages in the north first, which would give the Russians a significant advantage in fighting over Turkey. So yet again, my opinion is that capturing them bit by bit through the north would be the optimal strategy, militarily speaking. But we do see the Russians have managed to gain some initial success storming Turkey directly from the east. I am, however, hesitant in believing that this would succeed because the Russians have attempted this before, and last time it failed. The situation has not changed much here in between Kreminna and Liman compared to other sections of the front line. In the direction of Kruhlyakivka, the Russians gaining this close access to the road points towards the Ukrainian defenses within Kruhlyakivka collapsing. There's a few positions, but it's much more spread out in the south, and in the northern parts is simply a dacha area. This means that the main part of Kruhlyakivka is now under Russian control. If they're able to send FPV drone operators to Kruhlyakivka to operate from there, they'll be able to spread havoc across the Ukrainian lines. See, Sinkova entirely is within FPV drone range. Koslinikivka is entirely within FPV drone range, and Zahrisove is within FPV range. So all 3 settlements will be direct targets for Russian FPV drones. Based on that, the Russians would have a significant advantage fighting further these settlements all across the Uskir River line. So the losses taken to capture this settlement is significantly worth it in terms of the military advantage FPV drones give in these sort of operations. So if the Russians are able to hold on to these settlements of Kruhlyakivka, prevent a Ukrainian counterattack, and continue offensive operations in the direction of Koslinikivka, Sarisova, and Sinkova, then the Russians will be able to continue their momentum and advance further in the section of the front line, significantly improving their positions and gaining control over the eastern bank of the Uskir River line. In the direction of Kursk, the Ukrainian offensive operations to gain control over areas here to the northwest of Marshanovka is one I talked about in my previous video, where I talked about how the Ukrainians are vulnerable here in the northern parts of Sucha. If the Russians manage to do a pincer maneuver, they'll be able to gain control of Marshanovka without fighting it directly with the positions in the farm areas northwest of Marshanovka. However, now that the Ukrainians have secured the northern flank, they would be able to avoid such an operation by the Russians. Therefore, the Ukrainians can now relocate more forces to this northwestern parts to secure the western flank of Sucha. Now, the Russians will continue defensive operations here in the south towards Bondarivka and Sochia in general. This will allow the Russians to cut off the supplies to Martinovka from the south. But again, the Ukrainians would be able to resupply Cherkassko, Porishnoe, and then through that, Martinovka, although it is close to the front line, it will still be possible. There will be no encirclement by the Russians. So this has secured their positions near Martinovka a bit, and it has improved their positions. So generally, it is the right decision to take for the Ukrainians, although they still have no solution for the entire western flank collapsing, and that is a massive disaster for the Ukrainians, and I do not understand why they do not consolidate their positions, withdraw from it, and then secure the western flank, or simply withdraw out of the Kursk region. Either of these are more correct than simply pushing deeper into Russian territory. And that is all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.